Hey everybody, welcome to the 10% True podcast. Quick message from me before you get stuck in. This podcast is free, so there's no advertising. I don't monetize it on YouTube. You don't have to sit through any annoying adverts, and I don't even ask for any money through Patreon. But if you could, in exchange for that, drop me a like, leave a comment, share my content, and if you're listening to the podcast version, maybe leave a review of the channel, that would be hugely appreciated. It will help me to grow my audience, which is really what I'm trying to achieve. Anyway, with that, I'll let you get back to listening. Enjoy. Paul, welcome back to 10% True. It's great to see you on the podcast again.
Great to be here again.
Thank you. We talked a couple of months ago, and my viewers will be aware, of course, of your participation in that wild weasel interview that I did with you and some of the other guys that you had served with in Southeast Asia. So as far as we're concerned, it's sort of 1971, 1972, you've finished your tour flying F-105s in the wild weasel mission. The purpose of today's conversation principally is really to talk about the YF-23, but I didn't want to just go straight from talking about Southeast Asia to the YF-23 and not really fill in the gaps in between. So I was wondering if maybe as a starting point, you could talk a little bit about what happened when you came back from Southeast Asia, where your Air Force career took you and why it took you in that direction.
Yeah, well, we brought all the airplanes back from Southeast Asia, the Wild Weasel airplanes, and wound up at George Air Force Base. And so I instructed there for about 2 years, and bringing some new guys into the program. And also they were transitioning over to the F4G at that time, slowly. So that was my post-Vietnam assignment. I'd always had a desire to be a test pilot. And so I went ahead and put in the paperwork that was required to go to Edwards Air Force Base for the test pilot school. And in December of '74, I managed to eject from an F-105. And interesting backstory to that is I love aviation history. And so I jumped out of this F-105, only to come to find out after I jumped out of it and destroyed it, that it was scheduled to go to the Air Force Museum to recognize Leo Thorsness, who got the Medal of Honor flying in the F-105. And I destroyed a piece of history in the process. The reason it required ejection from the airplane was the engine quit. Failed a tower shaft bearing inside the engine, and all the supporting equipment, flight controls, everything just froze up. So it was time to leave the airplane. But I met Leo Thorsness just a few years back before he passed away, and I did a mea culpa to him, said, "I'm sorry I destroyed your airplane." He laughed it off and said, "Yeah, I understood." He used to call the Air Force Museum once a month and make sure that they were going to receive his airplane. "Yes, sir, we're going to have your airplane here." And then I come along and blow the whole thing out of the water. But I did apply for test pilot school, and I got an assignment in 1975 to go there. And so I did a 1 year in hell and got my pilot's license, test pilot license, if you will, and went to work on base. Did several small programs, the HARM missile, initial HARM missile workup on the F4. I spent most of my time with the F5s, Northrop and the F5s, and that led me to the future associations with the company. So that lasted through 75, 76. And the last assignment I had was I got positioned to Pax River Naval Air Station to teach at the Navy Test Pilot School. So I did that till 1980, and that wound up my Air Force career. 1980, I go to work for Northrop, did 12 years with Northrop. Got out of that, after we'll talk about the YF-23, and went to work for Lockheed for 14 years. So I got 12 years in the Air Force, 12 years at Northrop, and 14 years at Lockheed. I cannot hold down a job. but that's kind of a quick thumbnail. After Lockheed, I finished up Lockheed with the F-35, but I was no longer flying. I was the manager of flight test for that program, and then retired in 2006. So that's a quick thumbnail.
That's quite a career. I mean, that's impressive. So, but why test pilot then? What was the allure?
Well, I guess that's in my DNA. I enjoy engineering. I got a degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from the Ohio State University, and I just enjoy that aspect of what makes things work, and especially going out in the discipline of flying a test program and bringing back data and crunching the data, working with engineers. That all appealed to me. It doesn't appeal to every pilot, for sure, but that was my desire, was to become a test pilot.
Was the experience of going through test pilot school what you thought it would be? I think you just described it as a year of hell.
I say that not too much exaggerating, but it is the toughest education that I have ever been through, mainly because it was a combination of classroom work and fairly rigorous classroom work, and then flying. The school now actually grants a master's degree for that 1 year, and they didn't at the time that we went through. They had not achieved that status, but it is very rigorous. It's time demanding. You never stop, and sleep seems to be in the way of everything. So it's a rigorous program. It's you meet some great people, and you have some fond memories of it. But yeah, the old saying is, would you go back through test pilot school if I gave you $5? And the guy says, no, I wouldn't do that. He says, would you go through test pilot school if I gave you $1 million? He said, no, I wouldn't do that. Why are you asking? He said, well, I just wanted to find out how stupid you were.
What were the challenges for you then going through that program? You've talked about the rigorous classroom activity. Was the flying very different? Was that a set of challenges that you had to overcome as well?
Yeah, the flying is different. But it's more than flying. It's the preparation for the flight. It's flying the flight. It's gathering the data. It's reducing the data and reporting the data. So those are the steps you go through. So one flight is not just let's go fly for an hour. There's much more to it. And it is very demanding in terms of precision that you fly. You must learn to control the airplane to 1 knot plus or minus a knot of speed and altitude within 10 feet. And those sort of precision kinds of flying that's required to get just data, engineering data that you need. So it's not at all like combat flying. It's a very disciplined form of flying.
Do you do, if it's not a silly question then, as a test pilot, do you sort of lose the, I don't know, the sort of team focus in the aviation sense, in the flying sense? Because I guess as an operational guy, you're always going to be a part of a 2-ship or a 4-ship. You're always going to be flying with somebody else. And I guess from what I understand, at least, a test pilot type sortie would be your wingman would actually be on the ground. They would be the guys running the telemetry, or monitoring what the airplane was doing or what the weapons were doing that you were testing. So do you end up sort of with a single ship sort of mentality around your flying?
Not at all. It's exactly the opposite of that. I felt more of a team kinship with the engineers and the people helping execute the program, even more so than I did in combat flying formation with a wingman, as you pointed out. No, the training that the team goes through, it's very much like a slightly toned down version of a space shuttle launch or Apollo launch. You have a mission control room, you have engineers in there, they've got data strips they're looking at, and you're trying to fly precisely to their specifications. When an emergency occurs, you need their help to control the airplane, figure out what's gone wrong, get it back on the ground. So we train. For the YF-23, I trained for 9 months with about 30 engineers, simulating that first flight and simulating every possible emergency that could come up. And you get to a point in that relationship after that long a time that you're mentally and bonded to these other people, and you operate as a team. And that's much more powerful team type arrangement than I found in the combat arena.
How about the culture then? If you're sort of bonding with those individuals, and we talked about this when we talked about the Wild Weasel, or you guys talked about that when you talked about the Wild Weasel experience. Going to the bar, a lot of learning done in the bar. The sort of the building of that camaraderie. Did you have the same sort of culture then outside of the cockpit or outside of the mission with those engineers?
No, and that's an excellent observation. No, it's more of a professional type of relationship. You would go out occasionally, but it was not like the combat environment we discussed with the Weasels. So that part is distinctly different. Yet the bonding is deeper, which is kind of an unusual thing. So bonding doesn't have to occur over a beer; it can occur with the interactions in the normal business environment.
I suppose risk is an everyday activity, especially fast jet back in those days. I guess it's sort of much safer now, but still risky business, but much safer now than it was. Well, was there a sense then in the work that you were doing as a test pilot that it was more dangerous than maybe going out and flying combat, or flying a continuity or a continuation sortie stateside?
No, I can't say that one was more dangerous than the other. There are more unknowns from the airplane side of the picture in flight test. There are less airplane-related issues with the airplane that has been fielded and operational. Your unknowns there in the combat arena are the enemy. What's he going to do? How's he going to respond? And what's my chances of getting through this alive? In the flight test world, you have a lot of unknowns. You're taking an airplane up for the first time. Yes, a lot of ground testing has been done. A lot of simulation has been done. But for the first time, you expose the airplane to the real world, and invariably things happen. And hopefully you can control them. Sometimes you can't. I don't know whether you've ever seen the famous video of the F-14's first flight coming into land, and they lose the flight controls and they both punch out on short final. That was a test program, an unexpected event. So, and Challenger accident with the space shuttle is an unexpected event. And so that's the kind of things you face versus combat types of threats or risks.
Are there? We'll talk about the YF-23 in time in this conversation, but are there particular sorties or particular test programs then that you did as an Air Force test pilot that really stand out in your mind for being challenging or frightening you, or putting you in a position where you were really tested? No,
I don't have anything that stands out. I've had some experiences where the unexpected happened, but nothing that I would say scared me. And in that sense, that's interesting. That's another good observation you made. In combat, there's a fear that the enemy's going to kill you. Somebody's going to kill you. You don't have that overt sense of threat in a test program. And in fact, you're trained, and you train others to make sure that if you have an emergency, this is what we're going to do. So the failure may come as a surprise. Oops. But then you hopefully said, yeah, that's just like we saw in the simulator. Here's what we do to recover this airplane. So it's a little more controlled and structured, I guess, than combat, which is a bunch of human beings trying to kill each other.
That for me, that's a fascinating point. Then the idea that you would be so prepared for something that when it happens, or if it happens, your reaction is based off of that preparedness rather than off of some innate instinct. I mean, you obviously have flown so many airplanes, all about seat of the pants flying, all about instinct, and whether you're on one airplane or another, how you would maybe handle an out of control situation. Is there a balance between when those things happen, reverting to some kind of seventh sense, some kind of just pilot instinct, or applying a set of procedures that you have learned in the simulator?
I think it's training. It really is. Go back to the example of jumping out of the F-105. This was in peacetime up at Cuddyback Range in California. But I was doing a dive bomb pass, and it's practice dive bomb pass, and released the practice bomb and began to pull out. And just as I reached wings level and nose level, the engine quit. This sequence of events lasted just a few seconds after that. But I looked down in the cockpit. I looked at my fuel flow indicator. I looked at other indications in the cockpit. I looked back up outside. The airplane was slowly rolling to the right. I reached over with my left hand and pushed the ram air turbine lever out to extend the ram air turbine. Gave me a little bit of roll control. Rolled the airplane back to wings level. Told the rear seater to eject, eject, eject. He went out and I went out. I look back on that and realize that was my training. That wasn't some gut feel of, oh my God, what do? I don't understand what's going on. That all came out in a matter of seconds based on the extensive training. So you develop mental motor skills, if you will, from your training that I take you through. If you ever get to the point in an airplane where you're panicked, I don't know what to do, I'm going to die, you probably lost the ball game right there. So our training and flight test or training in combat is to develop the mental motor reflexes.
It would probably be remiss of me not to ask you, because you mentioned it now a couple of times, but what was that ejection like? Temporal distortion, did time slow down? Is it difficult to believe that you actually did it? How did you experience it?
Yeah, when I look back on it, realize how much data I took in and how many things I did. Selecting emergency fuel was another thing. But looking at the things I did, it amazes me that the training was that imprinted on my brain to do that. So yeah, it's a matter of response, autonomic response, but a well-disciplined autonomic response. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Yeah, was it traumatic? Not in the, afterwards you were traumatized by it, but was it very violent?
Yes, it was violent. I got out about 400 knots, and another little thing, the ejection seat in the airplane had been modified to carry a force deployed parachute during Vietnam. And it put a hard metal plate in the parachute pack. And what we didn't understand was it made you actually sit with your head forward of the headrest. So when I ejected and hit that airstream, my head was snapped back against the headrest and twisted sideways to my right. It was very violent. It's hard to explain, but it feels like driving into a brick wall at 400 knots. And then the chute snapped open, and I was pretty close to the ground, so I looked down and it hit the ground.
Wow. Well, what then, as a test pilot, do you want to achieve? Are there sort of, when you graduated, are there programs that you look at and you think, well, I'd rather not do that. I want to do something that's cool or sexy, or are they all viewed with the same level of sort of worth and value that all the different programs that are available to you?
Well, yeah, I think you take each one as a task to exercise those skills and talents that you received for the year in test pilot school. So I don't think there's a bad one there. Some people, well, you always have a choice getting out. We had heavy drivers, C-131s or C-130s, various types of slow movers, fast movers in my class, had navigators with me. So you have a choice, but generally the Air Force is going to place you into an aircraft of your type. So if you're transport, you're going to go to a transport test program. If you're fighter, you're going to go to a fighter program. But you also have the ability to request where you want to go. You would go to Edwards, you want to go to Eglin, you want to go to Holloman. And so those factors enter into it. I think everybody in the class was happy with their assignments. And the main thing is to be challenged with a test program that requires your skills to execute it well. And as long as it does that, it's satisfying. I did flight test on an AN-2 Antonov Colt.
Did you?
Yeah, so biplane testing.
What were you testing?
We had a program where, this was at Northrop, where one of the customers was trying to stop the infiltration of sapper attacks using an AN-2 at night, coming down mountain ridges and dropping off these guys and then taking off and flying out. So the test was to figure out, could you find these things, these AN-2s, with a fast mover and shoot them?
Cool.
So I won't go into the details of that, but we did some work with it. And so that was one end of the spectrum. And then you go to ATF, and that's a different end of the spectrum, but they're both intriguing.
So from your point of view, then, what was the end game? So you're now a test pilot. You've accomplished that sort of dream. Where do you go from there? Did you want to be a careerist? Can you be a careerist as a test pilot?
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's all the way up to 3- and 4-star generals that are test pilots. And there is a track of test piloting jobs, the running of the Edwards Air Force Flight Test Center is usually a 2-star job. You'll wind up going to the Pentagon sometime. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I got out, is I had the assignment at Pax River teaching at the Navy Test Pilot School. And my next assignment was to go to the Pentagon. And I wasn't particularly fond of that. I still felt like I had test piloting I wanted to get out of my system. So yeah, it's possible to move up and stay in the test pilot arena, not necessarily flying test missions. You'll move into management positions eventually.
It's a bit of a tangent, well, a complete tangent, but the RAF has this concept of specialist aircrew, which is your ability to say, I just want to fly for the rest of my career, and they freeze your rank, freeze your pay. You don't climb up the ranks in terms of seniority, but you stay in the cockpit the whole time that you're in the Air Force. And that seems to be a great way of building real experience and depth of experience. Is that an attractive thing? From your point of view? I mean, obviously you're retired now, but would that have been attractive? Do you think that going to places like the Pentagon, or doing exchanges, or going and working with the Army for a year as a forward air controller, or ALO or whatever, do you think those things have their own merits?
Oh, I definitely do. And the Air Force, of course, had up or out as their mantra. And in other words, if you don't keep moving up in the management chain of command, then you're out of the Air Force. But I think that is an exceptional way to, as you say, bring talent and keep talent within a certain specialty. And it makes us for a stronger test organization when you have that depth of talent. So no, the U.S. doesn't do that. But yes, I think it would be helpful if they did. And not just in flight tests, even in the operational world, there would be, I think, those same benefits.
You said then that you were working on the HARM program. That's the high-speed anti-radiation missile, and that was that an outgrowth of Shrike or Standard Arm, or was that a completely separate program? Where did that come from?
Well, it's a Navy-funded program initially, but obviously it's an evolution of the Shrike kind of weapon. It's kind of more of a marriage of Shrike and Standard Arm capabilities, but it was a separate, HARM was a separate weapon and a separate weapon system development program.
And you said that obviously meant that you ended up working in close proximity with Northrop. So how did that work? And what is the where are the lines between the DoD and the military sort of contractor? When you're working with a defense contractor like that, do you sort of share everything and anything with them? Is there compartmentalization? How close can you actually end up getting to them?
Well, the world of test in the United States had changed dramatically from the 1950s and 60s, where you had what were called Category 1, Category 2. The Navy had BIS trials and other forms of testing, and they were repetitive. In other words, let's take Northrop as an example. Back in those days, Northrop would do a test on the airplane, specific tests to find out what's the range, what's the G loads you can get, and structurally, does it sound? And so Northrop would do those tests, And at some point, you would turn it over to the Air Force, and the Air Force would repeat the tests and do it themselves. And they soon found that in a 3,000 flight test program, that is a very wasteful way of doing it. So they now have combined testing where the Air Force and the contractor simultaneously test the jet. On Tuesday, the Air Force guy may take it up and do a test point. On Wednesday, the Northrop guy may take it up and do the following test points, not repeating it, but doing additional points to fill out the envelope for structural testing, for example. So you're shoulder to shoulder in terms of day-to-day flight testing with the contractor pilots, contractor engineers, face-to-face with their Air Force equivalents. And the same with the Navy. I think the Navy, not sure about this, but I think Navy may even have eliminated their separate testing in what were called BIS trials, Board of Inspection and Survey, which was wasteful. So everybody's taken on this more streamlined approach to testing.
Did you have views on those sorts of things as you went through, prior to going and teaching at Pax River, which sounds like it was sort of your swan song in terms of your Air Force career. But did you have views on those sorts of things as you went through and you observed the efficacy or the efficiency of the test program? Or were you really just focused on the flying? Were you able to influence things outside of that?
Well, I certainly noticed them, but I didn't have the power to influence in a structural way the way that we did business in the Air Force, if that's what you're asking. I was much too low in the chain of command, but I certainly recognized where there were efficiencies and inefficiencies in the process.
So you would have been, were you a major or a lieutenant colonel at this time?
I had just made major.
Okay. What was teaching at Pax River like then?
Well, that was a real eye opener for me, an Air Force guy, amidst all these Navy guys, and it was quite different. They had something called the reasonable man concept, and I didn't at the time. I didn't understand what it was, but in the Navy, in the sailing ship days, British, I'm sure it was the same way. Once the ship sailed over the horizon, this home command could not influence the captain's operations. The captain had to do it on his own. And so decisions were based on the reasonable man concept. In other words, if something happened on the voyage and they come back to port and the captain reports in his log that he had to keel haul a sailor, they would ask the question, would a reasonable man have done that? In other words, do we hold the captain culpable, or did he do what a reasonable man would have done? And they carry that attitude with them in their daily operations. You do what you have to do that's reasonable. And if it turns out to be reasonable, then even if it violates the regulations, that'll be okay. And I found that to be an invigorating environment to work under. The Navy does do their test pilot school different. The pilots, the Navy pilots, and the Air Force pilot in my case, are pilots. They are not classroom instructors. They have civilians who are classroom instructors, or at least they did when I went through there. They have a differentiation of duties. They also have a mental attitude that was different in the Air Force, not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, but the Navy saw their role as an officer and a gentleman in their khakis. You weren't an officer and a gentleman in your flight suit. So when you weren't flying, you got out of your flight suit and got into your khakis. And that, to me, had some negative benefits, because the mind didn't always stay in the cockpit as it does in the Air Force. You're always thinking about flying, and they got away from that. They almost treated it as a second calling. So that was different there. But nonetheless, I enjoyed that more than any other assignment I had in the Air Force. And it was the reason, actually, if I'll be honest, that I left the Air Force, is because of the reasonable man concept and the way of operating.
It's very interesting. So what, before we get on to that and explore that a little bit, then what were you flying at Pax River? Were you
Well,
flying anything different than you've flown at the Air Force test pilot
yeah.
programs?
Unfortunately, being an Air Force guy, they said, okay, you're an instructor in the T-38. I said, I've done the F-5 T-38 route. So they gave me an OV-1 Mohawk, which was actually a blast to fly. I enjoyed that. Flew the Beaver and the Otter. I flew the X-26, which is a Schweitzer 232 glider. They tolerated me in the cockpit of a helicopter as long as an instructor was there, and as long as we didn't have to do anything more than just go up and land. It was beyond my capability. And then I got to fly a P3 once, but it was a variety of aircraft. I got A4 one time, I think. Got the T2C. I got checked out late in my tour to fly T2C with students on spin demonstrations.
I noticed and I don't want to, I'm not trying to embarrass you or sort of pull you up on anything, but when we did the intros for this has just gone to when we did the intros for the Wild Weasel interview, there were four people, and the three other guys went first, and they listed the airplanes they'd flown, and I was thinking, that's quite impressive. This guy's flown 6 different jets and so on and so forth. And then you came on. I said, I can't remember what the figure was. I've flown 70 different airplanes, and I've got 5,000 hours or whatever. And so my question was going to be, do you get to a point then where you have flown so many aeroplanes, you can pretty much, so notwithstanding helicopters, but aeroplanes, fixed wing, you can pretty much get in anything and fly it? Is the degree of sophistication of the aeroplane in terms of how its hydraulics configured, or its electrical and pneumatic systems, does that really impact you? And the reason I wonder that is because when you read about World War II guys, for example, when the airplanes were much simpler, they would just be given a handbook and told, you want to go and fly a Typhoon? Are you rated in the Spitfire? Yeah, okay, we'll just go and pick up this book, read it for a bit, and then you can go out and fly one. There's one out the front. Did you have the same level of not ability, but the same level of accessibility to these airplanes after having flown that many different types?
No, I mean, it's not like a World War II days, and you described it accurately as far as my readings have revealed. No, today you really have to know the airplane better before you go fly it. Now, I will say that of the 70 airplanes, many of those were with an instructor pilot. And one of the things we didn't talk about test pilot school, you're taught to be flexible. You're taught not to have preconceived notions of an airplane. And so they expose you to many different kinds of airplanes. In test pilot school, we had just a huge variety, F-106s and F-105s, and airplanes from the Navy and airplanes from the Army, and they put you in them. The A7 was interesting because it's a single seat airplane. They did give you the book for one night and said, read the book and go fly a single seat, single engine airplane. But what they're trying to get across to you is airplanes can be different than you expect. So don't expect them to be like the airplanes you've flown, and be flexible enough that you can change your gains, which is your human response to the airplane if you need to. And that is probably one of the biggest lessons you take away from test pilot school, is being flexible as a pilot. So I'll never say I can fly anything you give me, because that would be a little bit too braggadocious, I think. But I will say that you learn to be flexible as a pilot.
Talk about sort of expressions regarding aviation, and one of them is that if it looks good, it will fly good. Terrible grammar, but is that true in your experience?
I don't know. The Mohawk flew great, and it looks like in your garden eating lettuce.
But do you sort of develop this sense where you can size up an aeroplane before you fly it? And I mean, this is the continuation of what you've just been describing, which is don't have preconceived ideas, but can you? I mean, you can look at airplanes, say, I said 106, okay, it's a delta wing, so I know that if I, get slow on the final turn, I might end up behind the power curve, and I might not be able to recover it. I mean, are there those sorts of things that you, because of your experience and your academic understanding and education, you can look at an airplane and not instinctively, but instantly be able to figure certain things out?
Yeah, I think you do that. The Draken is a case in point. I never flown a Draken and got a chance to fly one, and I knew that it would do exactly like you say. It's a low aspect ratio wing. It's going to have high induced drag, so don't get slow with it, low to the ground. So yeah, you certainly in a Antonov Colt with a biplane with a low wing loading is going to be flying about the same speed all the time, no matter what you do. So I think certainly you get general impressions or have general impressions of an airplane based on its shape, but there have been a lot of sexy looking airplanes that didn't fly very well. And the thing we have going for us now is that modern digital computers have the ability to crunch the equations of motion, which are the foundational equations that determine the dynamics of flight. And in so doing, they can actually be much more precise in their predictions. And so you don't get a surprise nearly as much as you did in the old days before we had high-speed computer simulations.
I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? The development of computing power, let's say, to run things like flight control systems, full authority digital engine control systems, that type of stuff. Does that actually end up eroding the quality of the test pilot then? Because with those things active and present all the time, some skills atrophy. The stick and rudder skills, the ability to. I mean, if you just take a helicopter as an example, helicopters in the 50s had no governor. You'd have to roll on the throttle as you apply collective in order to make sure that the rotor disc didn't stall. And now there's a governor, an electronic governor or a mechanical governor. So now you just pull up on the collective and it automatically increases fuel to the carburetor, which, keeps the disc spinning at the right speed. And so I guess sort of helicopter pilots back then would probably have been better sort of stick and rudder pilots or stick and pedal pilots than they are nowadays. So does the same apply then to test pilots in terms of, there's maybe a transfer of speciality from the stick and rudder to understanding complex systems and computers?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the history of aviation, in the 50s with the second generation of jets, we went to the Century series of airplanes, higher, faster, bigger, heavier. But the simulation wasn't as good. So we had a lot of unknowns and gotchas. We lost a lot of airplanes in the initial phases of operational deployment, the F-105, for example. But the interesting thing is, instead of exploring higher and faster, today, the F-22 and F-35 are in fact, in some cases, are not as fast as some of the Century series airplanes. So what is it we're doing? Well, an airplane is not defined by how high, how fast today. It's defined by the capability that the avionics give it. So flight controls are one aspect, but the weapon systems becomes much more dominating. And the weapon system is dominating because it's a digital base, and it can do so many more things than you could do in the 1950s. So the airplane is defined not by its raw performance, but by its digital performance, if you will. Having said that, with flight controls, there are cases where you get the unknowns in areas of the envelope where you have a very difficult time, even with computers, of computing what the results are going to be. Nonlinear flows, simple thing of coming in and landing in ground effect. We still have difficulty in that area. High angle of attack departures and high rotation rates and that sort of thing. The computer may miss it and has missed it, and we have to go back and retune the airplane. The nice part is you don't go up and hacksaw off the top of the vertical fin or bolt on a Humpty Frats on the wing. You go into the software and you change the software to make the flying qualities different.
So here's a it's not really a philosophical question, although there's, I suppose, a philosophical element to it then. So taking what you've just described as, the aeroplane being characterized now not really by how fast or how high it can go, although those are obviously important, but the central hub in terms of its weapon systems and its sophistication, its ability to reach out and achieve a kinetic kill or an electronic kill or whatever it is. Is that what has led to development programs really stretching out. I mean, if you take, you said you worked on F-35, you take F-35 as an example, F-22, the F-22 was actually, what was it, 10 years or something like that from first flight to entry to service, but F-35 I think is longer. And then you compare that to some of the Century Series fighters where they may have been developed over a couple of years. Is it that sophistication that's caused that, or is it an industrial thing, or is it something to do with the way that the military contractors work these days that has meant that cycle is protracted?
Well, that's the $10 billion question, because something else that has occurred that is different is the cycle time of knowledge is 18 months. And by that, if you're familiar with the Moore's cycle, where computer capacity and memory double every 18 months, if you have a program that is 4 years to the first flight, and then maybe another 5 years before it's fully absorbed into the operational environment, you go through many orders of magnitude of the computer capacity. So the thing that's obsolescing is not the aerodynamics of the wing or any of that. What's obsolescing is your tactical ability via the computer.
Mm.
So now, if you draw the cycle time out, what you're going to be able to do at best is field an obsolete vehicle.
Yeah.
And that is different about what we do. And I've looked at a bunch of the older programs. They typically took less time, maybe 3 years from first flight to completion of the test program. But I think the real thing is this digital obsolescence that drives things today. And our 4-year programs exacerbate the problem of digital obsolescence.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're definitely. I'm going to have to bring this back to YF-23 soon, otherwise you're going to say you have to go. But just if I may, because you have worked on F-35, and just picking up on, one of the criticisms of the F-35 is that it's been, it's still undergoing testing. There still isn't a full suite of software available for it. It still doesn't have the full mission capability in the originally intended sense of the word. I've been to Nellis and I spent some time with the 422. I've done it twice, and everybody I spoke to there thinks it's a great airplane, and they can see that it will get to where it needs to be. And if you look at earlier programs, something like the F-15, when it entered service in 1974 or something like that, that thing entered service with radar problems. It didn't have a full electronic warfare suite. The airplane matured over time to the point where in 1991 it went out and did its job with alacrity, and the Israelis have used it that way too. So there is an element of, I guess, pragmatism around the fact that maybe some of these things don't go into service and on day one being able to do all the things they should do. But one of the criticisms you hear of the F-35 is that it just won't get there. It just, there's always delays, there's constant delays. And then if you feed into that argument what you've just described around Moore's law and sort of memory and CPU power, is there is there an end state for something like the F-35 then? Is it always just going to be iterations of software, or will it get to a point where it does what it's supposed to do?
It will get there. You can go back in time and see that almost every airplane that's ever been fielded has had difficulties. I was told, I was at Wichita with the F-105 for about 3 years, and I was told that the Wichita, they have a plant, they're Boeing plants on the south side of the field. And they were producing B-47s, and they said at the time, the B-47s would roll out of the factory floor, do a 180-degree turn and enter a mod line. So the brand new airplanes could be modified. So to have problems during the initial introduction of a new airplane, while aggravating and frustrating and a target for the political arrows, it is not unusual to have something that complex have problems initially. So it will achieve a fine operational record, but it does take an aggravating long time.
Can I ask you one more question about this? And it is loaded. Well, is it loaded? I don't know. You determine whether or not it's loaded. But there is a group of gentleman similar sort of age to you, from sort of who had illustrious careers in the Air Force in the 70s. So Pierre Spray, Darth Granrod. I don't know if you no, it's not Granrod. I can't remember his surname. Darth Drabant, who did the operational tests for the F-117, and he worked with the Red Eagles, and that foreign military exploitation piece was very heavily involved in that. He was I think an acolyte of Tom Christie and Boyd, who are very, very critical of the F-35. It's the wrong platform. We don't need it. And one of the things that and Darth hasn't said this, but I've heard Pierre Spray say it to a Marine colonel who had flown the F-22 and the F-35, whose name escapes me, when he defended it, was that he was a company man. He was in the pocket or the pay of Lockheed Martin. But do you think that there is any valid criticism of the F-35 in that sense? Is it the right aeroplane for the mission? So forget about whether or not it can do it. Is it the right aeroplane? Should the Air Force have been looking at something that was lightweight, more akin to an F-16A than the F-35 that it is? Or do you think that those are invalid criticisms?
Well, I'll be honest, I've been retired since 2006, so I don't have the inside knowledge of the F-35 program. I've heard this argument before. In fact, as you point out, the F-16 was the LWF, the lightweight fighter. It did not start off as an air-to-ground machine. In fact, most of the originators of the YF-16 are probably apoplectic to look at it now and see what it's being offered up as. So that pressure to have a cheap, light, swarming gnats is something that is not the first time with the F-35. I don't know what people would say the F-35 mission is that it doesn't fulfill, or the F-22 for that matter. You often heard the argument with the F-22 of the Cold War is over. Why do we need an F-22? I have not read what specifically Spray or some of the others are saying. The mission is that we need an aircraft, not the F-35, but some other aircraft to solve.
Let's get back then to your career. I've taken you down this rabbit hole long enough. So what then led to you? So you said the sort of reasonable man concept was what ultimately made you decide maybe not to go back to the Air Force. But what led to you joining? Was it Northrop that you joined?
Yes.
Okay. What led you joining Northrop?
Well, I had a good association with them. As I mentioned, one of my last assignments in the Air Force before I went to the Navy was the F-5 program. And so I was the only test pilot on the F-5 program at the time. It was winding down, but I had a working relationship with the company. And so when I finally decided that I was going to try to continue test pilot work, but in the civilian environment, Northrop came to mind, and I put in a request to be interviewed. And as I recall, I also went to the airlines and tried to get an airline slot. And so I was just job searching at that point. And Northrop knew me, knew of my work, and hired me.
Did you, again, it's just maybe an ignorant question, but did you know what you were going to be doing? I mean, obviously you want to be a test pilot, but did you know what you would end up flying? Was there a stream for heavies or fighters like you described earlier?
I didn't know about the F-20 like I should have. And I assumed that I'd be doing F-5 test work. There was still some F-5 testing going on in the company. And so I took a pig in a poke, if you will, not really knowing what exactly I would be doing. And it turned out that I was assigned to the F-20 program, which was another challenge and very interesting airplane to be flying.
So for people not aware of that, that's a single engine sort of based on the F-5 APG-66 radar, F-16 radar. MFDs, a sort of modern cockpit by the standards of the day. It was championed by, I don't know if this was a commercial thing, but didn't Chuck Yeager get behind it? But ultimately it wasn't successful. What was your take on the F-20 story then?
Yeah, it's APG-68, by the way.
68,
and
okay.
yeah, F-20 Tigershark was an interesting evolution of the F-5 family. The F-5 had filled a niche starting in the JFK years of an airplane that was supportable and maintainable and flyable by our allies around the world. And so it became a foreign military sale airplane that was flown by 33 countries. And it went through the F-5, excuse me, F-5A and B, then to the F-5E and F versions. And it was about every 20 years was upgraded in its capabilities. So the next logical step was another upgrade from the F-5E and F, and that became the F-20, which was a single engine Mach 2 version of the basic F-5 T-38 design.
Was it good? It sounds compelling.
It was excellent. It was the one airplane that should have been built and should have been fielded. It was killed by political considerations. The country for about 40 years had provided these types of airplanes to our allies around the world because they were so efficient and easily maintained and easily flown. And so we did that for 40 years. And it came time for the follow-on, and the F-20 was nixed by Carter initially, who said, we can't sell airplanes to our foreign allies because it causes the world to become unstable. And everybody jumped in. The French jumped in, the British jumped in. Everybody said, well, we'll sell them the airplanes. And Carter did a 180-degree reversal and said, oops, maybe it's okay to build this. So we built it. And Nixon supported the F-20. And the real turnaround came when Ronald Reagan said that he would sell F-16s to Venezuela, Pakistan, and South Korea. And suddenly, an airplane lesser than the frontline US fighter was being offered to third world countries and allies around the world. And at that point, there was a general feeling that if you give it to this X country, I want one just like the X country has. And the F-16 took off, and that killed the sales for the F-20. So national policy of what we were going to export in terms of military hardware changed the outcome of the F-20 program.
What did you rate about it then from a pilot's point of view? What was it that was so compelling?
Well, the concept of the family of airplanes, it really is about having the most airplanes available to go to war. And so they are simple to work, operate, and they're very reliable. And they have a tremendous up rate, our operational ready rate. And the F-20 had all that, but it had high performance, and now it had digital avionics. The APG-68 radar was a tremendous radar. It could shoot the Sparrow, and we did that, carry a variety of weapons, and was not as expensive as an F-16. So there was nothing technically that was wrong with the airplane. It was a political problem that doomed the airplane.
Sort of wary of not sort of, again, sort of broaching sensitive subjects. But one thing that I was sort of curious about, I don't know if enough time has passed for you to feel like you could offer a view on this, is exactly how far out that radar could see in the nose of that airplane, because it's a little skinny little nose, skinny little radar. I guess the unclassified information around Sparrow is that you could shoot it out 15, 20 miles or so. Was that sufficient to be able to do that? Because of course you need to be able to see the guy, sort your targets, do the whole, going through the process of trying to identify if they're good guys or bad guys. Was that a really short range capability, or was there a sort of true BVR capability behind the airplane? No,
it had a true BVR. That it's hard to see from the pictures of it. They moved the radar bulkhead back 15 inches, so that the radar dish became larger, which is a measure of how much energy you can get out there in space. So it had a respectable BVR capability, lock on and track while scan radar. So yeah, it was definitely, it was a step beyond the F-5, a significant step beyond the F-5, and more closely approaching current fighters at the time.
Was the ATF sort of on the horizon at this point in time than the Advanced Tactical Fighter, which eventually resulted in that F-22, F-20, well, YF-22, YF-23 sort of fly off?
Yeah, most people don't realize that in 1971, the Air Force began studies of an advanced tactical fighter. Now, this is before the F-15 even made its first flight, before the F-16 made its flight, and people were already thinking about the future. So there was work going on in, if I remember right, there were 9 aerospace companies that took on the challenge of exploring the fighters of the future. Nobody knew at that time whether stealth was even doable. And so many of the designs were not stealthy, but they were advanced fighters at the time.
So stealth, I suppose, things like the A-12, the SR-71, Lockheed had developed the sort of sawtooth capabilities and radar absorbent materials to help reduce the signature of that platform. But was stealth generally a well-known concept? Low observability, was it a well-known concept? Through that time.
You left out the Horton 229.
The Horton 229, of course, the flying wing. Yeah.
Well, it was intentionally stealthy. The production version, there was one that was flown, but the production version had 5mm plywood skins with a powdered graphite packed between the skins.
I did it.
The two layers of plywood. Wow. To absorb radar energy. So it was intentionally, and it accrued by our today's standards, but certainly the poll tests that Northrop did with a full-scale model showed that for the radars of World War II, it was quite effective, stealthy airplane. So the concept of an airplane that's hard to see has been around for a long time.
I just think about that story about the F-117 where the mathematics, as I understand it, maybe I'm recalling it incorrectly, but the mathematics behind it had been published in a paper by a Russian scientist or mathematician. And I just sort of wondered whether, generally amongst sort of the tactical Air Force community, if there is such a thing, people in that space, whether there was a real sort of appetite to pursue that. And frankly, how the Russians managed to miss it is sort of beyond me. Maybe they saw it and didn't want to do it. I don't know. But, so are you saying from 1970 onwards, there was a pursuit for a low observable tactical fighter, or are you saying that was just sort of a side quest, if you will?
Well, in 1971 was a quest for an advanced tactical fighter, but the issue of stealth was not known well enough to say definitively. In fact, the Air Force couldn't even decide definitively if they could put stealth in an airplane in 1971. They were just looking at advanced aerodynamic designs. It's interesting. Your question earlier was if it looks good, it flies good. What's the F-117's problem? It obviously reflects one type of theory about stealthy designs. The F-117 is what's called a faceted design. So that's one type of design. And obviously we don't build airplanes that look like that, thank God, today. So it must mean that the technology has advanced beyond the F-117 type of faceted structure. And I don't know why the Russians didn't put 2 and 2 together, or maybe they'd put 2 and 2 together and said they didn't want to have frying pans flying in formation.
How did you get into ATF then? When were you introduced to it in terms of you being a participant in Northrop's program?
Well, let's see. It must have been about 1980, probably 85 or 86. I was called down to an office by a guy named Del Jacobs, who was a retired general officer. And he took, I think, 4 of us pilots into a room, and on the desk, he had a model of what was the YF-23. And although we didn't know it as YF-23 at the time, and I remember him talking, and I cannot remember to this day what he said. I was so focused on that airplane because it was so beautiful. So that was my introduction, and I didn't at the time know that I would one day be flying it because it was still in the future, 1990. So that's how I got introduced to it. And then from that time on, I was fully engaged with the YF-23 program.
What were you doing then? So what was your contribution to that 4 or 5 year period then until the first flight?
Well, in all the programs I've been involved with, it's getting with the engineers and working through bit by bit, piece by piece, the design of the airplane, from a hydraulic system to the flying qualities to the flight control systems. And that's probably the most important part of a test pilot's job, is to interface with the engineer, who is a good engineer but doesn't understand flying, and being an interface between the operational pilot, who is a great pilot but can't explain why the airplane flies funny. You have the test pilot in the middle, interpreting that and understanding what the operational pilot says, and turn that into engineering language, which the test pilot also has, because we have engineering degrees. So we're an intermediary in the process. And quite frankly, I think I found more enjoyment and satisfaction working with the engineers to develop an airplane than the actual flying of the airplane.
Right. Is that process collaborative then, or is it sort of hierarchical? So would, for example, because you've got the conflicting, and I guess they are conflicting, demands of low observability and aerodynamics, presumably driving the shape and the look of the aeroplane in terms of how it's going to cut through the air and fly and generate lift and bounce radar signals in a different direction or absorb them or whatever it's going to do. So would they, the people responsible for that, come and say to you, well, Paul, we're going to stick, we're going to change the angle of the wing, or we're going to stick this here, or we'll stick there. You need to figure out how to, what the impact is on sort of from a flying qualities point of view? Or would they come and say, can we do this? So are you collaborating, or are you dealing with what they give you?
No, I think actually a lot of that actually goes on within the engineering community, and it's a natural counterpoint. The aerodynamicist wants that smooth aerodynamic shape, and the low observable guy wants nothing to do with it. So you have a natural, it's not animosity, but an engineering push and pull on how we solve this problem. And the pilot can get in there and do such things as say, geez, guys, the canopy bow here is blocking my forward vision. What can we do about that? And then they might go back and redesign the canopy bow. I got involved a lot with flight controls, and so how the flight controls operate. But the actual give and take of the design occurs within the engineering community. The engineering community fights for the lightest weight, highest performing piece of machinery. And sometimes those things are counterproductive. You can't make something super light without it being unreliable or not having the strength that is required. So I put it this way, I used to call it the chocolate and vanilla ice cream example. If you get with an engineer when he's busy creating a system and he says, look what I've got, Paul, and you look at it and you go, that's pretty vanilla. Could you do it in Tutti Frutti? He'll say at that time, says, yeah, I think I can do that in Tutti Frutti. And that is a time when the airplane is moldable, changeable. And you have a chance as a pilot to make an input and change the systems. Because the engineer, in many cases, picks something that he thinks is right, but he's also amenable. And sometimes as much as it's easy for him to change the design when it's on paper. When an airplane is operational, it is very, very difficult to change anything about an airplane. It's expensive. You have to go retrofit or have mod lines. And so but once it's in paper, or while it's in paper, it's moldable, meldable. And so that's how the process works.
So there's a couple of obvious questions around that. So I'll try and simplify them. But so the first then is, between your meeting in sort of 85 or so and 1990, how much did the design of the airplane change?
Well, in the paper stages, it changed a lot. In my book that I wrote, I've got some pictures of the various iterations. One called a Christmas tree, which was stealthy and looked like a Christmas tree plan form wise, but was horrible at high angle attack. There's an example of the yin and yang between the competing designs. The LO design was great. The aerodynamic design was stinking. So the two had to get together and say, how are we going to solve this? And they changed the shape. So the Christmas tree only looks remotely like the YF-23. So there were changes. The more interesting one, I think, is the difference between the YF-23 and the F-23 and the YF-22 and the F-22. There you see refinements of the design. In general, they look similar, but they definitely made engineering improvements on both of the production versions of those airplanes.
So the second question then is who arbitrates those design decisions? So if you've got the yin yang, the natural tension between LO and aerodynamics, when they can't agree, who comes in and says, well, we're going to go with this or that?
That's the job of the chief engineer. And when the chief engineer can't resolve it in terms of schedule or time, there's a program manager who makes these next level decisions of, well, you don't have time to change that. We got to go with this. So it's a hierarchy of authority that reacts to changes.
I just wonder sort of how easy it was to work on this kind of stuff. Did you you think of something like the F-117, and you can kind of understand why they were, there were drapes between, sort of where they were building it, and, very, very, sort of careful not to let anyone see it. But, the F-20, the ATF program, let's say the YF-23, the YF-22, that was tested in public, for want of a better description. It wasn't tested in a sort of black context. So, I just wondered if that made life easier, if the constraints of something like the F-117 would have puts an additional strain on the development process.
Well, I wasn't directly involved with the F-117 test process, so I don't really know. But there are some things that slow you down or constrain you. But for whatever reason, the Air Force decided to take the ATF public with at least some notional drawings initially provided to the press to bring it into the white world, if you will. But there was still a lot of technology that was classified, even though the public could see pictures of the airplane.
What about the the efforts of your competitors then? My understanding is that the Air Force doesn't share the designs. There's no sort of technology sharing between what they're looking at from one defense contractor and or another defense contractor. Did are you in any way interested what the other guy's doing? Are you in any way curious, well, I wonder if he's or she's designing the airplane in the same way, or what we're going to be up against? Does what the other person's doing have a bearing on what you're doing?
Well, you're obviously, being human beings, you're curious, and you're being challenged with a program that could be worth billions of dollars. So there's certainly a question of how those guys doing. Do they have any problems, and what's their design look like? Sure, that's just natural human beings, but no, we remained pretty isolated. Dave Ferguson was the chief test pilot for Lockheed at the time, and one of the things was we were physically and intellectually separated physically from the other team and could not discuss with them. But Dave and I got together as chief test pilots, and we said, look, Dave, we know we can't talk to each other about what we're doing, but if there's a common problem that affects us, that could affect our air crews, for example, we all both have the same kind of engine, same Pratt & Whitney and Pratt & GE engine. If we have a problem, we're going to get with the other guy and tell him what's going on with his problem, so we don't have a chance of one of our people getting hurt. And that was our agreement, and we had to do that one time. But otherwise, it was hands off, eyes closed, no discussions, and we followed that.
Do you think? I mean, that they are different designs, and I'm not trying to get to a point where we make any assertions about there being copying or anything inappropriate like that. But do you think it was inevitable that the design similarities between the two platforms would be there? Do they speak to the fact you've got the sort of outward canted tailplanes or stabs, maybe as you call them, that sort of well, you'll describe the design properly, but a sort of trapezoid type wing, Do you think that's just what stealth or low observable designs look like at that time? So it was kind of inevitable you'd end up going with sort of similar approaches, or you've just described faceting as one approach, but there are many others. Was there the potential that you'd actually come out with quite different designs?
Well, when there's specifications or requirements, if you will, one of which was you must carry certain weapons internal to the airplane. So that starts to define the form and shape of the airplane to carry weapons of a certain size internally. You want Mach 2 capability that determines aerodynamic shaping and coefficients of drag and so forth. So it doesn't surprise me that you didn't wind up with radically different designs between the two companies. Although I would suggest that, to me, the YF-23 looks different than the YF-22. So the unique assembly of the pieces resulted in two different looking airplanes. But in the words of the Secretary of the Air Force, when they awarded the contract, both airplanes met the requirements. They had greater faith that Lockheed could execute the program from a management point of view. And that was their public announcement. And I've never seen anything else in writing over a period of time that was different from that pronouncement.
We're sort of skipping ahead to the end of that particular story, but maybe while, as you've mentioned it, we can just sort of cover that off there. And so you did a fantastic presentation for I think it's called, is it the Pennsylvania Seniors? It's Betty. I can't remember her. It's one of my favorite YouTube channels. I love it. Anyway, but I think you talked about that at the end of your presentation. Was there an element of PR then in the decision? Did Lockheed just play a blinder, as we'd say in the UK? Did they do just a great job of doing some PR and making that case? Did you have a view on it?
Well, yeah, you're referring to that peninsular talk that Jim Sandberg and I gave on the YF-23. Yeah, I have felt, and I mentioned in the talk, that there is an element of showmanship in these things. You got to respect your customer, may not be technically as astute as your engineers are. They are looking at the airplane as a whole. What does it do? What can it do? Does it appear to be a well thought out design? And part of the issue that I believe is that you do things in flight demonstration that catches the people's attention and accentuates whether you've got your arms around this design. Lockheed went up into high angle of attack testing to 60 degrees angle of attack. Now, this is during the demonstration and validation program. So they did high angle attack testing. They shot missiles. They went to 9 Gs on their airplane. I can't tell you the number of people come up to me and said, "Paul, did you know that the YF-22 pulled 9 Gs and shot a missile at 60 degrees angle of attack?" I said, "No, I didn't actually know that." Well, they did not happen simultaneously, and they were, in retrospect, heart of the envelope kind of flying. They were not extremes. The missile launch was a benign type of condition, but on film, it looked really good. And Lockheed chose not to do those things. Not that they couldn't have done them, but they chose not to do them. It turns out that the YF-23 has the same 60-degree angle of attack capability that the YF-22 has. The YF-22 can be at 0 airspeed and still pitch its nose because it has thrust vectoring. The YF-23 could not do that. However, it's inherently a stable airplane and it's very stable at high angle of attack. But none of that has a picture associated with it. Only Lockheed has a picture associated with it. And I've always felt that there's some element of the selection of an airplane that a show of capability leaves an impression with a potential customer that, hey, this thing can do this and this other thing can't. And it wasn't that YF-23 can't, the YF-23 chose not to do it.
we've definitely skipped the YF-23 test flying bit, so we'll come back to that. But let me just stay with this for the minute then, because I think it's I'm keen to understand emotionally what that does to you. I mean, so first of all, you're a Type A personality. You don't like losing. That's probably a standard trait for most fighter pilots. Second of all, you've invested all this brain power and sort of commitment, and you have all this expectation around this program being good. You believe in it. How does it feel then to find out that you didn't win? What's the, is it sort of crushing in the sense that you when you see athletes who don't win a final, a sports final, sort of on the ground with their heads in their hands? Is it that sort of experience?
I would say it must be. I don't know what that athlete is feeling, but yes, it's very discouraging. I mean, the YF-23 followed the F-20, which was a discouraging outcome. So yeah, it is. But you can't let that drag you down. You've got to get up to the next project and shake it off.
Yeah.
And so does the athlete.
So let's talk about the airplane. And how would you describe it? The YF-23. How would you describe it?
Well, these airplanes were in the 50,000-pound class. If I remember, the original specifications was 50,000 pounds and $35 million a copy. That was the boundaries, and it's since busted those boundaries. But that was the box that they were built around: 50,000 pounds, $35 million a copy. The airplane was optimized for stealth. It was a very low observable airplane. It was very clean, taking off two of the aft surfaces, the empennage surfaces, and replacing it with the V-tails, resulted in a very low coefficient of drag. So the airplanes were very fast. There were certain things that we wanted to demonstrate in the ATF. One was what's called supercruise, the ability to fly the airplane at supersonic speeds without using an afterburner. Super maneuverability that was at least equal to and hopefully greater than the existing F-15, F-16 airplanes. And advanced avionics that allowed you to see but not be seen. So those were the things that were to be demonstrated. And the shape of the airplane is optimized for stealth, optimized for performance. The avionics part of it, we talked about that earlier, about the digital influence. The avionics portions are as cosmic as the airplane is, and they were tested on a flying test bed airplane. And both companies, Lockheed and Northrop, had their own flying test bed airplanes. So, but the airplane was easy to fly. It was just almost mind-numbing how easily it flew from landing to takeoff. Formation flying was just a delight. Air refueling was a delight. It's the only airplane I could take my hands off the throttle and sit on the tanker. Really? And I could relax the grip on the hand grip, and it would just sit there. I never got to the point where I took my hand completely off, but it was a beautiful, beautiful flying airplane. And again, the credit goes to the engineers, but it also goes to the fact that we have the computer power to simulate that and make corrections before we ever fly to the flight control system.
Paul, I've got 1,000 questions. I don't know how I'm going to get through this next bit, but so the first question I would ask then is this: you talk about handling qualities. You earlier said it was inherently stable. I think it's probably fairly well known things like the F-16 are inherently unstable. What are those two things, and why do they matter?
No, let me make it clear. It is an unstable airframe. But as you change your angle of attack, as the center of pressure shifts because of the aerodynamics, you want to, and Northrop has kind of patented this approach in their aerodynamic science. You want the airplane to naturally recover itself. So as the aerodynamics are such that as you go to these high angles of attack, which normally would result in departures in an unstable airplane, you want to be able to the airplane naturally wants to pitch back down out of the condition. So at high angle attack, it acts as a stable airplane, i.e. pitching out of the condition, not departing from the condition. At normal flight angles of attack, it is an unstable airframe.
So so in my mind then I'm thinking, well, if you've got computers that are handling all of the flight controls and stuff, does it really matter if it doesn't want to sort of come back out of that high angle of attack condition in a sort of calm way?
Well, that's a design philosophy. Northrop has always, with the F-5 family of airplanes, always assured themselves that no matter what happens, including flight control failures, that the airplane will on its own recover. The F-22 is a wonderful airplane example. Literally, our emergency procedure for out of control is remove your hands and feet from the rudder pedals and hands from the stick.
Right.
And let the airplane take care of it. It'll sort it out every time. You can do a lot with digital flight controls, but if you go to what's called saturation, in other words, you get to the point where you're commanding the full throw of the control surface to recover the airplane, and it's not recovering, you want the airplane to naturally be able to recover. And that takes special design qualities in the aerodynamic area.
You mentioned as well then the avionics and the test bed. It's a surprise to me actually to learn that was sort of part of the, and maybe I should have done some reading. I should have read your book before we had this conversation, but it's a surprise to learn that was part of the competition. I always sort of assumed that, the low observability and the aerodynamic qualities of the airplane were one thing, but then just like the engines, the avionics would be maybe a different thing. The Air Force might buy a platform and then integrate avionics into it that it had selected separately. But were you therefore working on common avionics with the same guys, with the same avionics as the YF-22 team, or were you building your own avionics capabilities?
No, both companies built their own avionics systems, and I got involved in a lot of the simulations to determine what is the effect of each one of the sensors. Does the sensor buy its way onto the airplane? Is a sensor worth putting on the airplane from a weight and cost point of view? So how far away should your radar detect another airplane? And how many missiles do you carry, and how do you effectively use them? So we get in, as pilots, we get involved in that aspect of the design.
We've touched on computing power a lot in this conversation, relatively speaking. And one of the questions I'd asked you earlier was whether or not sort of test pilots, as you were going through your experience as a test pilot, you were seeing sort of test pilots become more managers of computer systems and of avionics and that kind of stuff. But at that point in time, were you doing things like sensor fusion? Were you trying to simplify the job of the pilot to figure out what was in front of him or her, or how to protect himself, or how to go and kill the bad guy? Or were you still sort of in the 90s sort of frame of mind where, you've got a radar warning receiver, you've got a radar, you've got a radio, you've got ESM, whatever?
No, that was one of the first and foremost design criteria. It was what we call carefree abandon. The airplane must be able to take care of itself. The pilot can do whatever he wants to do with the stick and throttle, and he cannot damage or hurt the airplane in any way, or the equipment. So that's part of carefree abandon. And the cockpit side, very strictly disciplined to provide you, the pilot, a picture of the situation around your airplane without knowing whether you're seeing it on the radar warning receiver or on the radar or a sensor, another sensor. We had what was called sensor fusion. You have sensors on the airplane that can see out around the airplane. And what you do is you take that information in from multiple sensors and put them into a single solution. There are two airplanes at your right 2 o'clock position, 47 miles, X number of speed. That reduces the pilot to a tactician, not a systems operator. And that's very important when you're traveling at these high speeds and closing quickly on the enemy. And so, that was the big push, was to use the avionics to simplify the pilot task.
Again, it's not something I know much about, as is evident in this conversation, but I remember sort of some pictures of the YF-23 cockpit. It looked like you had a heads-up display from an F-15E and maybe some MFDs from something like an F-15 or an F-18, something like that. Were you doing things as granular as playing, as in you personally, as playing with color and playing with shapes to represent those things on a display?
Well, first of all, the prototypes bore no resemblance to the production cockpit.
Okay.
They did just, in fact, it had a digital engine displays, and that had just digital displays, but they were taken right off of F-15 and F-18, just as you said. So there was no attempt, there was no radar, there were no sensors on the prototype airplanes. That's where we explored it in the flying test bed, for all those things. We had a pilots group of non-test pilots, but pilots group that did the yeoman work in coming up with the displays and colors and enemy aircraft indicate the details of the actual display were done by a group of pilots in pilot vehicle interface. PVI was the organization.
So when did you first fly it?
Flight 1, August 27th, 1990.
And how was it? So, you've talked a lot about simulation. So did you knew what sort of speed it would unstick at? You knew what sort of speed, it would take flight at? How close to the simulation was it?
Well, it was right on the money. In fact, I get a kick out of thinking back on it. We did the simulator. I must have done 1,000 landings or more in the simulator, testing the flight controls for what was called power approach or the landing configuration. And the computers were not all as that we have today, but they were not bad. It had a visual of Edwards Air Force Base and the final approach into Edwards Air Force Base, and fly that, fly it, and fly it, and fly it, just many, many times. So the day of the first flight, I go fly, and the airplane behaves just like it does, and it's time to land. I come back on landing, and I have this funny feeling of deja vu on final approach here. I said, I've been here. I've been here 1,000 times, because it operated exactly like the simulator. No surprises.
Are there parts then of the envelope that are easier to simulate than that? I mean, you talked about, I think, did you call it laminar flows or some kind of flows that are difficult to, high angle of attack flight is difficult to simulate. So as you progress through envelope expansion, did you start to find a sort of divergence between what was in the sim and what was in the real airplane?
No, we didn't. The problem with the prototype program for both companies, you only had about 90 days to do it. And we had very few flights. So the emphasis was on getting out to supercruise conditions so we could prove that it could supercruise. But that meant foregoing a lot of the detailed testing we would do at the lower and mid altitudes for a normal test program. So I call it tunneling. We kind of tunneled out a portion of the flight envelope that got us up to 35, 40,000 feet where we could do some supercruise testing. And we didn't go down low altitude at high speed, high dynamic pressure, but we did go out to, here's another point. We intentionally did not go to Mach 2.0, not because it wouldn't go there. In fact, the number 2 airplane with a G engine could go quite a bit faster than that. It was just an engineering decision not to go to Mach 2. But we didn't go to the more risky areas, which are high dynamic pressure, low altitude, high speed, 800 knots. And we didn't go to the high angle attack, which I've already mentioned, over on the left-hand side of the flight envelope. So it was an unrealistic flight test program in that regard. Both airplanes did not get enough flight testing out of them that they should have gotten.
The supercruise point, I wanted to ask, it might be, I'm not trying to be difficult, but it might sound like I am, but I understood that, supercruise was a capability, for example, the F-15E had already, PW229 engines on an F-15E in mil power, it will go Mach 1.1, Mach 1.2, something like that, it will supercruise quite comfortably, but the Air Force had, discouraged people from talking about that. So was it really a surprise having, you described the aerodynamics of the airplane and, the fact that it was built for speed? Was it really a surprise to find that it could do it? I mean, you're literally just doing it as a checkbox exercise rather than to determine a capability?
Well, yeah, it meant we expected those speeds, and so where there's no surprises to it. You checking the box, yes, but you also, what you're doing when you're out there, you're exposing the structure. You're looking for flutter. You're looking for we had some problems initially with a shock wave standing over a vent and causing a flow interruption. So you're looking at detailed kinds of things with systems. Hydraulic systems, does the temperature stay low on the hydraulic system, and so on and so forth. So it's just not a matter of going super cruise. You're at a condition where all these systems of the airplane also are looked at.
Can we explore that process a little bit then? So if you take the shockwave over the vent, so how do you troubleshoot that? Is that sort of rendering as some ambiguous or erroneous data or something, and then you land and somebody has to go to a wind tunnel or put it in the simulation and try and figure out what might cause it, and then what's the process of understanding what's actually happened?
Well, it could vary all over the place. Sometimes you see an effect that an engineer understands inherently what's wrong and goes and changes something. Software in particular is, again, very amenable to changes. So sometimes the engineer will see, oh, yeah, that's happening, and I understand why. Other times, if it's a pernicious type of problem, yeah, you might go back to the wind tunnel and say, what's going on here? Do I see it in the wind tunnel? High angle of attack is an area where the unknowns tend to rear their heads, and where you wind up having to sometimes go back. Well, you do go back and change the flight control system. Rarely, but sometimes you'll actually take it back into the wind tunnel. That's where the biggest unknowns lie, is the left-hand side of the envelope.
From a pilot's point of view then, so are there, I think you've kind of touched this, but I'll ask anyway, but are there sort of certain flights where you're particularly careful about your preparations, where you're particularly cognizant that there are some risks, or there were more risks than maybe the last flight, or there are more risks than there'll be in the next flight? Does your approach change, but does your, mentally as you step and you walk towards the airplane, are you thinking slightly differently based on what you're going to do?
Well, actually, the test plan that outlines the entire test program actually has rankings or ratings on the programs. There are high-risk programs, there are low-risk programs, flight points that you get. So high risk, low risk, medium risk, and there are mitigating procedures in there. What happens if we get this? What is our knock it off? If we're going out to a high speed, low altitude, and we're at 700 knots, and we see something not quite right in the data, structural data, we stop, we come back, we analyze it, and then go back and try to push ourselves out a little bit further. So it's like everything in flight tests, it's a very structured approach as to exactly how you test and what is the meaning of each one of the test points. Are they high risk? Are they low risk? So I think, and the mission control room as well as the pilot knows that as he walks to the airplane. So we're kind of mentally cocked to, hey, this is a risky day, let's keep our eyes open for structural problems or whatever it happens to be.
You talked a little bit about some of the differences between the YF-23 and the YF-22. You mentioned thrust vectoring. Was there what was the reason that thrust vectoring wasn't something that you wanted to put on the airplane, or you did put on the airplane?
NASA had the Air Force had a test program with the F-15, advanced technology fighter technologies. And one of them was thrust reversing. Thrust reversing is different than thrust vectoring, but they looked at thrust reversing and decided that at 600 knots, throwing a thrust reverser open would take a huge structural strain on the airplane, and it really wasn't something that would make a difference in air combat. So they dropped the idea of thrust reversing. Thrust vectoring was looked at in what is it, the X-29? I think it's X-29. And you use paddle blades to vector the thrust there. And that had certainly some neat effects at very low airspeeds. So the conclusion was that thrust vectoring, if used, will be used at low speeds, not at high speeds. And in fact, that's what was designed into the F-22 and YF-22. Northrop looked at the data and said, I don't think that's as important as very low stealth. Getting in the turning fight and being able to outturn a guy at zero airspeed is less important than having a very low observable signature. So, and the companies were allowed to go those directions. They took their own independent solutions to the overall problem of what an advanced tactical fighter is. So that's what was driving both designs, internal decision.
That's another interesting sort of conversational topic, isn't it? I think around this time, I'm pretty sure the Russians had attended Paris. I think they were at Paris Air Show in '89. They crashed a MiG-20. Pugachev, I think, crashed a MiG-29 there. Well, he didn't crash. He took a bird into the engine, didn't he? But anyway, but we knew, as in the West, knew about very high quality sort of angle of attack capabilities of things like the Su-27, MiG-29. And sort of their design philosophy around that. And then, of course, through the 90s and so on, you started seeing thrust vectoring arrive on sort of later versions of the flanker. Your personal opinion then, having been through Vietnam, having seen the F-4 where they took the gun out, they deigned that all air combat in the future was going to be air-to-air missiles, and you take the threat out beyond visual range, and there wasn't going to be any BFM. What was your personal opinion then as to the balance between getting a good low observable BFM, a BVR capable fighter, and one that could also then turn and twist and fight in close range?
Well, the history of aviation is studded with cases where people could not give up on the old way of doing things. The U.S. Navy stayed with biplane fighters longer than the U.S. Air Force, going to the monoplane. I think my personal opinion, air-to-air combat is today, with all aspect missiles, you're a fool to get yourself slow and start a turning fight. And the reason is because when you start a turning fight, you basically stop your airplane and the enemy's airplane in space. You're in a small, confined, turning fight. And somebody outside the fight can send a missile into that fight and kill you, or you can shoot the guy off bore sight with a missile. So the idea of having to classical dogfight, turn and burn, shooting with a gun, to me is becoming obsolescent. But you'll find the legends die a slow death, and you'll find that fighter pilots will still swear, by God, I need that cannon on my airplane in case we get in a turning dogfight. But the reason that the F-4 missile only approach was invalid in Vietnam is because the missile reliability was so poor. Missile reliability has changed dramatically since Vietnam era. And so I think there's less emphasis needed on a gunfight. And along with that, to be a good gunfighter takes a lot of skill and practice and training to get lead angle, shoot, and hit with a bullet another airplane. Not so with a missile. It doesn't require a lot of training, and you can just shoot it and let the missile go fly the flight towards the enemy aircraft. So my opinion is it's time for the dogfight to slowly go away, and it's not to me a dominant or productive way of fighting air warfare.
Paul, does ROE have any effect on that argument? So if you think about, I know there's a technical conversation about being able to identify whether or not somebody is on your side, a neutral or a bad guy, right? I understand that, and so there's a conversation around capabilities in that space that we won't get into. But politicians like to know that when they send people to war, they're not going to kill people on the wrong side, right? So does ROE come into that then, which is that, okay, well, you might have this all singing, all dancing capability to go out and reach out and kill the bad guy and beyond visual range, but actually a general might say to the president, well, we could make it so that they have to visually identify who they're going to shoot before they shoot them. So does that then negate the argument that there won't be close in encounters in the future, or do actually you just develop different tactics, which is your VID, blow through, 20 miles away and come back and then shoot him again.
Or technology can determine with a high degree of probability that is in fact a bad person out there. That's a red fighter. And I think that underlies all this discussion we're having is technology has to be considered and not rely on the past. Oh my gosh, we had a friendly fire shoot down. We can never have a friendly fire shoot down, so don't ever shoot unless you can ID them visually. Well, it may be that technology allows you to ID them very high probability without seeing them. And therefore, that relying on past performance and past actions is obsolesced by improved avionics. And I think I personally, I see that happening a lot. I mean, think about the accuracy of guided weapons we have nowadays. World War II, the CEP was 3,000 feet for a bomb from the bomber streams, 3,000 feet. Today, we've all seen pictures of a bomb going through a window or right into a building. So technology has allowed us to do that. We're not in World War II anymore, so we don't have to carpet bomb the world to try to hit a moving truck. Yeah. Technology allows us to do that.
What was the high point then of the program for you? What did you most enjoy about flying that airplane, demonstrating its capabilities and putting, Northrop's best foot forward?
Oh boy. Again, it was such a short program. It felt like it was over with before we even started. I personally enjoyed the airplane. I thought it would have been a great choice. Obviously, I'm prejudiced, but every flight was a delight, and mainly was working with the people. I had some really great engineers to work with, and that's what. And I think the same thing with the F-22. I had some of the great engineers in the United States that I worked with, and that gave a great amount of pleasure to the test program in both YF-22 and YF-23 and in the F-22.
Thanks for tuning in to 10% True. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, hit the bell button to make sure you get notified of the next episode. Thanks and take care.